It just sounds like a, barrel of monkeys.
It kind of is.
This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Are you searching for a new job? That can be stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles you don't actually want, and the job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. And sometimes you go all the way through the interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary, offer, or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. We make your job search faster, focused, and stress-free. Instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best, Hired puts you in control of when and how you connect with compelling new opportunities. After completing one simple application, top employers apply to hire you. And on Hired, you will receive personal interview requests and upfront salary information so you can make informed decisions about what opportunities to pursue over a condensed timeline. Hired offers access to more than 4,000 innovative employers, including big brand names like Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. And we help you find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Open to relocation? Let them know. Your privacy and autonomy in your job search is of utmost importance. And if you go check them out at the show's link, that's hired.com/adventures in Angular, you can get double their normal hiring bonus. So instead of $300, you get $600 for signing up at our link. That's hired.com/adventures in Angular.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Adventures in Angular. Today on our panel, we have John Papa.
Hello, everyone.
Ward Bell. And my personal favorite, way more than the other two, Lukas Rubelke.
I was just going to say, Ward, we're talking about the episode number, not how old you are. But,
We are not.
you know what? Favorite. Love you, Uncle Ward.
Oh,
Hello,
no,
everyone.
he didn't.
Uncle Ward.
Oh, goodness.
Wow.
Been a bad boy, Lucas.
And moving on
Hey,
from there,
Could have called your grandpa Ward.
Yep.
moving right along,
I'm putting my teeth in for this episode. I am.
We've already completely derailed. And I'm your host, Joe Eames. I'm not much of a host because I can't keep these guys on track, obviously. So today we are going to be talking about style guides. The Angular style guide specifically, right? We're going to talk a little bit about the Angular 1 style guide because everybody has an opinion on it, but we're mostly interested in talking about the Angular 2 style guide, and which is awesome because we have John Papa, who has been tasked secret mission, CIA level clearance from the Angular team to work on and create an Angular 2 style guide. Of course, you can see all of the work that's been going on in the GitHub repository, which is public, right?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So, guys.
I didn't realize it was a question.
It was a question. Well, I was more looking for verification than really a question. Are you actively contributing to that, working in that GitHub repo, or are you kind of working outside of it and then occasionally going back to it and then updating it?
So for Angular 2, a lot of my musings about the style guide, I've been very careful, first of all, to not put things out in my GitHub repo that I'm not sure of yet for the style guide. So it's kind of sparse at this point when you compare it to the 60 pages of printed Angular 1 style guide. But all the core things that I think we can all agree as a community are important and can be decided right now are there. The things that are not there yet are things that we're working on with the Angular team to figure out what is the best way to guide people to building applications. Things like naming conventions and folder structures and how lazy loading will work, and all that stuff is being worked out. But the process right now is we have some internal Google Docs that we're playing with. We map out some ideas. We get some feedback from various members of the community and the Angular team. And then that kind of progresses eventually into a GitHub repo, which we're determining the final resting place of where that'll live. And one optional place that might end up is in Ward's hands in the documentation, maybe.
Interesting. So, whereas before, was the Angular 1 style guide ever part of the Angular 1 documentation, or was it like just linked to?
It was actually, I don't think it's actually even linked to it from the main Angular pages. I don't think I've ever seen a link there. But so I started, a lot of people may not know this, but the Angular 1 style guide, I think the first one I've ever seen was Minko. He created one a long time ago, before I did.
Minko Manchev you're talking about, right?
Yes. And then, gosh, I think it was 2.5 years ago, something like that. Todd Motto and I were talking on the internet about Angular 1 and styles and how we had different ideas. And then we both had the same idea of, hey, why don't we publish this? And he put his out. And then I was talking about maybe I should merge mine with yours. Should I do them separate? And we just in the end decided let's have two different opinions on this and, give people options. So we both put ours out there, I think in the same month that summer. So at this point now there's 3 style guides, right? Mm-hmm. And some people are like, oh, that's awful. You need one. And some people are like, it's great because I get to see different ways of doing it. It's really each to their own. But that evolved.
Obviously, you felt like it was better to have multiple.
I really did, honestly, because my intent all along was not, this is a rule. I've worked for a lot of companies where my job actually was to define the rules by which developers would live. Otherwise, they'd be, thrown into the fire and never let back out. And I hated that. I mean, as a developer, who wants to tell you if you must use 4 spaces for tabs, otherwise you can't work here? Things like that kind of bug developers, and I didn't want to be like that. I wanted to instead say, look, here's a roadmap that you can follow, and the community's contributed to this. These we're defining as a way to guide you down to building good Angular 1 apps, but not just tell you what to do, but also tell you why, so you can learn how to think about the decisions and how they impact the rest of your application. And I think that's one of the reasons the style guide that I put out there has become so popular, because a lot of people feel like they have a voice in it. We've got 140 contributors on it now, so that's kind of the soul behind what it was.
Very interesting. So we've got the Angular 1 style guide. It's relatively well known, right? I would say probably a majority of Angular developers know about the style guide. I have no scientific evidence to back that up, but I think it's pretty well known about. And I think a lot of people were expecting an Angular 2 style guide. And were there people talking to you right from the beginning saying, hey, where's the Angular 2 style guide?
Absolutely. And yeah, the Angular 1 side, I still meet people who haven't heard about it, and then they hear about it and they're very excited because they like having something. And right now, I think it's in the top 75 GitHub starred repos, so it's pretty cool that it's that popular.
Wow.
But the Angular 2 one is impressive. Yeah, the Angular 2 one's interesting. Angular 2 is not out yet, right? It's not released. And what is a style guide? It's a way to define experiences of how you build applications. Now, who out there has experience of building one or more or many of these Angular 2 applications in production? Crickets?
0.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm very hesitant to just slam one out there and go, hey, look, this is what you do when you do X, Y, Z. And, well, what are you basing that on, John? I don't know. I just had a great dream, and that's what it sounded like a good idea. That's how you lose respect and trust, in my opinion. So to me, it's important not to put something out there until it's at least been vetted and something I can feel I can stand behind, which is why what's out there right now, and I just augmented my Angular 1 style guide, and I put my initial ideas up there. I created a draft and put the things in that I feel comfortable with right now. But there's still things that I've gone back and forth on, and Ward and I have batted some of these ideas around too.
Really?
Like naming conventions.
Mm-hmm.
So Ward, how many times have we changed naming conventions over the course of the alpha and beta with Angular 2?
Well, a fair amount. But what's interesting, actually, is that it seems to me to hew pretty closely to what we learned in the Angular 1 style guide. So I don't think we had so much churn on that. Do you?
I don't think there was a lot of churn, but I think it was a lot of thought when we did churn. Meaning, we might have only changed direction 2 or 3 times over a year. I mean, during alpha stage of Angular 2. But each time we did it, I remember very long conversations with you where we'd bounce around. Oh my gosh, I wish it was easier. I wish, how would it be more descriptive? For example, what we're proposing in part of the guide and working with the Angular team is if you have a component called, developers. The file name for that component would be developers.component.ts. So you would designate the .component as part of the name of the file. Now, that makes it kind of lengthy. So initially, I was like, I don't want to have to type that, right?
I thought it should be developers. Oh,
that's if you're using the Steve Ballmer syntax.
It's components all the way down.
And end in uppercase. So you actually have to kind of crescendo into that.
And you have to yell and sweat while you're doing it, yes. But, we said that, and then, what if you get rid of the .component? If you do that, it sounds great in a vacuum. But then, like Ward and I were building these sample apps, and started building larger apps. And when you do that, you realize that I might have a developer's data service, and a developer's pipe, or a developer's model, or a developer's interface, or a developer's component, or a developer's directive. And you go on. And when you don't put some kind of name into the file name, and you're looking at this in a large app with 300-400 files, it instantly becomes impossible to identify what you're looking at. Which does bring us back to the Angular 1 style guide, as Ward said. One of the concepts in there was I have to easily be able to locate and identify my code. I shouldn't have to hunt and peck through the files to figure out what is that.
Right.
So that's one of the reasons we kind of landed on, and we talked a lot with the Angular team and Igor and them about using some kind of extension on the file name.
But you kind of reminded me of the tagline for the film Alien, which is that when you develop in a vacuum, no one can hear you scream.
When you develop in a vacuum, nobody can hear you scream. I hear that about once a week when I go to the parks, by the way. They play that inside one of the Disney parks.
So I think we both have sort of a bit of trepidation, and I think you expressed it, trying to put together a style guide for Angular 2 when nobody has any real experience in it.
So let's circle back. I want to circle back around just slightly to Angular 1 and talk about you built it, but at that point, how much Angular 1 had you done, and then how did it grow from the initial version to, when's the last time some changes were made to it?
So when I wrote the Angular 1 style guide, it was after about 2 solid years of Angular development.
And in that time, what size of apps had you written in Angular 1?
How do you quantify size? Files, users?
Weight.
It all depends. About 400 metric tons of Angular code printed in dot matrix printer paper.
Rather than any specific metric, can we quantify them as small, medium, and large?
Well, John has small hands, but that doesn't mean his applications aren't very big.
But they are his own. Ooh, reference 90s.
Nice.
Sorry, guys.
So,
Ward, nobody can hear you scream when I come for you.
I don't know what it is with the pop references today.
I know. At the time, most medium-sized apps, I think I'd written one massive app at that point.
Okay.
Tons of small ones, a lot of those with Ward kind of playing around, and then a good number of medium-sized apps too.
Okay. So you already had 2 solid years of experience in Angular on some relatively, some big, some huge type apps, and that's when you developed the style guide. And then from that point till the last time a change was made to it, how did it change over time?
So, and something else to add there before I answer that, if you don't mind, is that it wasn't just what I derived from the style guide wasn't just from the apps I built. A lot of it was also from the apps that I helped consult with other companies on. So while I did not help them build some of these apps, they were also from, talking with XYZ large company who'd call me, we talk about their app, I'd come in, take a look at it with them, see what they built, and kind of look at the decisions that they had to make. So at least then I was able to learn, you know what, I wouldn't have done it that way maybe, but this is interesting because it solves that problem.
Right.
So there were a lot of other things that went into building that.
Right, and we were talking, and I had a whole boatload of these apps that either I had worked on or Idea Blade had worked on. And we had other people in the community, and there were other samples. There were things you could look at. So, you could feel that you had a pretty good survey of apps of various sizes and trying to solve different kinds of problems, and that things had kind of settled.
Just to mention something, I was highly disappointed at the time that you didn't come and talk to me about the apps that we'd been building and the stuff that we'd done, because some of the things that we'd invented didn't get into the style guide. I think it definitely would have been way better with my ideas.
It would have been better if it was all your ideas, actually.
So tell us, Joe, what don't you like about the style? Now you're on point, buddy.
Oh, man.
Go for it.
Actually, I think that there was one thing that we did. So I worked at Domo. We had close to 100,000 lines of Angular back 3 years ago. So it was really
By the way, before we go further, what do you use to do that? Is there a tool that'll tell you how many lines of code you have in your thing?
Yeah.
Or did somebody actually write a script to do that?
Yeah, no, there's a couple.
I've I've got to run that someday. I'm going to go Google it. Keep talking.
I don't remember what we used, but we did have metrics that counted our lines of JavaScript, and it was a little bit of a guess because it wouldn't say that this is actually Angular, and we were converting from Backbone as well. But we did a lot of stuff because it was just a ginormous app with like 20 front end developers on it, 20 Angular developers. But the one thing that we did was we actually, in our naming conventions, we had this idea. You divide up your application into areas by feature, right? Which is part of the style guide. But because of the fact that in one area you could need like a developer service, and in a different feature you might also want a developer service over there, right? So you'd have two services that both want to be called the developer service, right? And then what do you do at that point? Even if you have the naming convention that's like developer.service.js, it's still going to end up with the same name. So our idea was we came up with a either 2 or 3 letter prefix for each of the feature areas to really namespace Angular, because Angular is one big truly global. It's global within Angular, one big namespace. We thought that was very innovative, but it definitely has its drawbacks. I don't know that was the kind of thing that should make it into a style guide because it's just a little bit too specific. But nonetheless, I thought that was pretty...
That actually came up. I've heard that several times. People, for example, would namespace it with maybe the module name, for example.
Yeah.
Like the feature name.
That gets pretty common, too. I'd seen other variations of that, the namespacing, which definitely was an issue in Angular 1, right? It's a big, huge global namespace.
Yeah, I've seen, I know Dan Wallin, I don't know if he still does this, but he's a good friend of all of ours, and one thing he had done at one point with some of his apps was not the file names, but inside the modules, like the service, if it was developer service, like you're talking about it, he might actually name the service with the namespace as well. Mm. So when you're doing your injection, you can differentiate the developer services from the different modules too.
Right.
So,
it's a similar issue. It's the same issue, right?
Yeah.
You have to consider that. So we dealt with that. While we're on the subject, there's one other piece of your style guide I don't like, and that is separating the functions from having the function be separate from the line where you call the controller and create it, and you're just passing in the named function. I don't like that.
You mean like where we say Angular such and such module dot controller, and then right in there you're doing like an inline anonymous function? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah. Although we would actually make them non-anonymous by make them named functions.
Yeah,
because you would have the whole body in there.
Yeah, but put the whole body in there. I don't like that. So if we're going to complain about the style guide, then I want that one out there. But that being said, I don't think that's
can I just tell you why?
Absolutely.
But by the way, before Ward answers, this is the best thing about writing the style guide and having 17,000 people star it and chime in is I never have to talk about it anymore. Everybody else has an opinion one way or the other.
Yeah, that is nice. Okay, Ward.
So first, going back to your prefix thing, we used to do that when we wrote COBOL, so it's good to know that the COBOL still lives. But we had a thesis when John and I were talking about using the function names up there and then having the body down below. Mm-hmm. And that thesis had to do with readability and our thought that like a newspaper or table of contents, you want to see what's going on above the fold. And when you had something that had a lot of methods on it, you wanted to be able to get at a glance what the API for that controller was or whatever it was that you were creating. And by using the function names, we were able to give you that at a glance. And then you could jump down if you were really curious about the details of a particular thing. And that was our motivation. And I still
I don't think he's talking about the function names inside of the controller. I think he's talking about the actual definition of the controller.
Yeah, just the definition of the controller. So you say angular.module whatever .controller, and it takes in 2 parameters. The first is the name of the controller, and the second is the function.
Okay.
The style guide has the function defined elsewhere, and then you just put in the name of you pass in the name of the function.
Which would have been about 3 lines below?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So for me, it was white space and avoiding what's that thing called? The Pyramid of Doom?
Yep.
That nesting. Right. So that's what it was about for me with that. But I do find a lot of people ignore that. Not a lot, but I do find a good number of people ignore that rule and do exactly what you're saying, Joe.
Well, and I think that
like to nest it.
That is probably one that you would likely see ignored anyway, because so many samples are shown with it in line, and it's small, and you learn from your samples, you grow from those, right? And then you get big, and then all of a sudden you're thinking, crap, we need a style guide. And then you go and look and see, and then decide at that point, do I want to do this?
Yeah.
Or I want to not do this, which that's actually a great part. I love that about the style guide. The style guide was great. It is great. There's still a lot of Angular 1 being written. It's great. And I think that most people, when they get to the style guide, probably get to it to the point where they might have an opinion or two. And it's a nice way to... And I have to plug this as well. The fact that every decision is documented as to why the decision was there, right? I don't know if you mentioned specifically that white space thing, but all the rest of it, I've read through the style guide recently. It's all documented why to do these things, right? And people are going to learn a ton of stuff about JavaScript, just in general, and Angular in specific, by reading the style guide and seeing things they potentially did not know existed.
Yeah, that was one of the most important things about that design, about the style guide design, was that, so that people, that and the invitation to please go your own way. The only thing we really think is critical is consistency. But before you go your own way, John says, these recommendations aren't arbitrary. And, he's thought about what the consequences would be of going one way or another. And you get to see those things so that when you make your own decision to go someplace else, you're aware of the consequences of the decision you make.
All right, so I got to ask a couple more questions based on this same train of thought. One, did you ever consider putting in multiple recommendations for the same thing?
Yes, and at some point we had a couple things that we had that for. And some of those have been trimmed quite a bit for various reasons. So one example I can think of right off the top of my head was naming conventions for controllers early on. And I can't remember them all because some of them are gone, but I'm sure in the GitHub history has them. At one point, Ward helped me here on this, like we had a controller called developer. We were saying, this is what we see in the wild. You can call the controller, and I'm talking about the symbol. You can call the controller developer, or developer CTRL, or developer controller. There was all these different naming conventions people would name the symbol with. And quite frankly, I think the rule at the time was pick one, run with it, and forget about it. And I got some feedback. Actually, at one point, the style guide kind of grew on its own, which is something we should talk about. It grew beyond, hey, I documented this because I wanted to remember it for me. And it became, people actually like this. And Igor called me up and said, Igor Menard of the Angular team said, I would love to make sure I can go through this with you and approve it and kind of make sure it's what we have in mind and endorse it. And I said, cool. And he did that. And one of the things he pointed out was, this isn't going to work in that particular rule I just mentioned. And I said, I agree, but I don't really know what the right way to go here is. I just think consistency is important. And he had some really good reasons for not using CTRL. He said in his experience from the Angular team, a lot of people were very confused over what CTRL was. Is it the control key? Is it a control like an input on a page? Or is it the controller?
Right.
And this wasn't just coming out of his head, but people had actually said this to him.
In Microsoft, CTRL is often an abbreviation of control, as in physical control, right? Visual control.
Yep. Yeah. And not giving it any suffix made it confusing in the context being used somewhere else, because, okay, what is that now? It's developer. What the heck's a developer? A model? A what? So those two were two that he suggested getting rid of and just sticking with the controller suffix, even though it was longer, IntelliSense autocomplete tooling makes that easy. So that was one that evolved and started off as being one of those multiple options.
So my next question and related to that is, what did you do when you came to decisions where you didn't feel strongly about one way or the other and you almost felt like you're making an arbitrary choice?
I usually grabbed a beer or two. I can't think of a lot of those. I know we had many, but I'm struggling to find an exact instance of one for Angular 1. I'll scan the doc and see, but I didn't like documenting things I didn't feel strongly about, to put it very bluntly. Because I wanted to be sorry, I'm rambling. But what I'm thinking about is when I wrote something down in a guide, I made sure that I had a reason why. And there were several times when I wrote something and said, here's what I do. And then when I wrote the why, I came to a blank of, I just do it because I like it.
Right.
And to me, that wasn't enough of a reason, so I would delete that from the style guide. Because I felt like that's not good.
Yeah, there was some back and forth about whether you register the thing with the module at the top of the file or at the bottom of the file, because Dan and you had different practice there.
Dan likes the bottom and I like the top.
Right. And then there was some confusion, I think, about what's the best way to indicate to beat the minification problem with dependencies. Should I use the array? Should I put $inject on the class if I'm going to put it, on the constructor function? Do I do that before or after the constructor function? So these are things that we could have gone back and forth on, and I think you just picked something, right, John?
Yeah, on a lot of those, like the injection, we ended up picking, but we found a reason why, is kind of my point. For a while, we didn't add injection, meaning the ng-eject thing. And the reason we didn't is we were trying to figure out what we used it, Ward and I both, and a bunch of other apps. It's not just me and Ward who are doing this, obviously. But the people who were using it a lot, but we couldn't define why. And then later I realized the reason I do ng-inject, even if the tool that picks those up can find it on its own, is that I don't want to have to think about it when I write my code of which ones are going to get picked up by the tool and which ones aren't. So therefore, it's really easy for me to just write a template that automatically sticks ng-inject on top of all these guys and just does the work for me. I hate all
that stuff. I hate the benefit. We ended up using, I don't know if it was ng-annotate. It's ng-annotate now, right? It's the common tool that people use to min-safe their code. But I think there's a precursor to that back in the day. We used that, and then ultimately switched to ng-annotate. I hate writing the annotation, the min-safe stuff in my code, and I hate looking at it. I feel like it makes my code way less readable. And
it's ugly.
If you forget and remove an injection or add one, a dependency, remove a dependency or add a dependency, and forget to add it in the stupid inject statement or to the array. If you're doing the array, I hate the array's worse. The inject's bad because it's spatially different, but the array just looks horrible.
This episode is sponsored by Linode. Do you need a Linux server for your latest creation? Then check them out. They provide SSDs, 40 gigabit per second network connections, and top-of-the-line hardware to run your server on. It deploys Linux in seconds from the Linode cloud, and you can choose your Linux distro and node location right from the manager. They have locations in Asia, North America, and Europe, and they have a sweet set of tools to make it easy to manage it. If the web interface isn't your thing, they also have an API and a command line. So definitely go check them out. They also provide two-factor authentication, IPv6, DNS manager, cloning, scaling, and everything else that you want. So definitely get the most out of your Linux node and check them out at linode.com. And check them out at devchat.tv/linode.
And to be clear, Joe, I'm not talking about the $inject. I'm talking about actually sticking a comment at ng-inject above the statements.
Wow.
Because I don't like listing them twice because it's so easily that they get out of sync.
Gotcha.
So we were doing the comment. And actually today I probably would change that because when we wrote this, the ng-inject tool, I think it's ng-annotate as you mentioned, it wasn't great at finding a lot of the situations on its own.
Right.
Now it's really good at finding a lot of those edge cases. And honestly, you know what drove a lot of that was when I wrote the style guide, people were avoiding using that. They're like, I don't want to use it. And then I would see issues being opened up against ng-annotate of, my minification's breaking here, and here, and the guy who wrote it was fixing them all as it went.
Right.
So just the mere fact of me telling people to do this because you're going to run into problems drove a lot of people to try it. They ran into the problems, then they listed the issues, and I believe the ng-annotate tool now, I only know of one place where you actually need to explicitly inject, or the tool won't find it, and that's when you define an object literal inside of a route resolver that's not pointing to a function that's named, and in that case, it has no way of knowing that you're actually injecting.
May I just interject here and say I'm so pleased that the two topics we've spent some time talking about here are virtually disappeared when you write Angular 2.
Right.
Oh, I know. It's so much crap we had to deal with, you know.
Right.
I'm just so thrilled that I mean, you can get into those situations, and of course we're talking about Angular 2 with TypeScript. You're back in that soup if you decide to write in straight up JavaScript.
Yeah.
Or ES6, I believe. But if you can write Angular 2 in TypeScript, so many of these concerns mostly disappear, and certainly the modularity ones.
That's a great segue.
Actually, I have a funny anecdotal something I'd like to just bring up because I kind of laugh about it now. Is on Twitter, somebody actually commented on one of my blog posts that I wrote like 2 or 3 years ago about isolated scope, and this individual was like, "This post is why it's so much better to use some other like kind of paid proprietary framework over Angular. And he was basically commenting on just how confusing the directive, syntax for isolated scope was. Mm-hmm. And instead of smarting off, I actually played the high card and engaged in some conversation, and we kind of arrived at some middle ground. But I kind of had to chuckle because isolated scope and in directives was really, really complicated. And right at the beginning, I was like, yes, confusing API aside, this is completely solved in Angular 2. It's input, it's output, and you're done. And so, going from that confusing isolated scope syntax to just input and output is so much nicer. It actually deflates a lot of kind of those Angular 1 is confusing arguments for that reason.
Right. So that's a good segue to the Angular 2 style guide, right?
Where is it?
Where is it? When will it be finished?
John.
It's in your inbox, man.
I want to know when it's going to be finished. Like, finished. It'll be done. No more changes to it. And why that's not already done. Why you didn't have that for us 6 months ago.
Well, part of it is I have a day job. So let me kind of talk about where it's coming from, but let me also, I feel like I should qualify this with that. When I originally started writing the style guide, I didn't write it intending it to be what it's become. And I also didn't write it intending for everyone in the world to use it as their Angular guide, quite frankly. Like most of the time when I blog, honestly, and doing the style guide, I did a lot of this because I was working with a lot of teams that needed it, and I found myself repeating the same things over and over again. So I wrote this for a small group of people and for myself to remember a lot of these things. And by the nature of what it was, being public and open source, it just kind of picked up steam. So it's not like I set out to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to make the one guide that everybody's going to use. It just kind of grew there. And I also would be remiss if I didn't say how influential Ward Bell was to putting this together, because he really was tremendously influential into making many of these decisions, unfortunately.
Yes, if you don't like it, it's my fault. That's pretty much the way that boils down to.
But if you love it, thanks, John.
Thanks, John. And that's how it should be. It grew organically out of conversations, and it's true. You set out to try and make sense of the world you lived in and help other people just sort of, see it the way you did. And suddenly it turned into a beast with its own life, and that was good. And it was good.
And and the reason I kind of stress all that is the Angular 2 guide. There's this tremendous amount of. First of all, I'm not a guy who gets stressed out, but there is a tremendous amount of pressure from a lot of areas to have it already exist and be vetted and fine-tuned, brushed along the whole thing. It's perfect. And as I said, these things, it's just not realistic to say that anybody out there, including the Angular team, has built these massive apps that they understand the best way to build everything. But that said, I have taken on the main, task of documenting a lot of this to figure out what are the things that we do know and what things will we know soon are we working on, so we can put this thing together. And for right now, I'm putting it out into my same GitHub repo, the Angular 1 style guide. But I don't think that's going to be the final resting place for it. I think we're going to try to find a way to pull it into the docs. And I'm springing this on Word right now, live. One idea I had is to actually, instead of doing some of these samples as markdown inside of the triple ticks, actually do embedded plunkers inside of the page to show people, here's what you do and here's how this works. And so some of these ideas are starting to evolve, but it's going to mean that not only are we going to need the community to help us, but we're also going to need people who are building the docs to help us, like Ward's team, Igor, who's designing Angular, along with the rest of the Angular folks. We're going to need people building the CLI tool, and various other folks as well. There's a linting tool that I believe Minko is working on. So it's going to take a lot of people to contribute to say, these are the things we agree with, and this is what we're going to come up with here to go with. And then there's going to be a list of open items, too, of these are things we're going to have to tackle, but we're not sure yet what the right way is.
Yeah. I would parenthetically add, though, also, when you think about this, you're thinking about a guide to Angular 2 development with TypeScript. Am I right?
Yes. Right now, that's where I'm leading a lot of this, too. If you want to go back and use ES5 with Angular 2, quite frankly, a lot of the stuff's going to be the same as what's in the Angular 1 style guide, because it's still ES5 oriented. But I also think it's really, really, really painful to write ES5 with Angular 2. I wouldn't write ES5 with anything that I could write ES6 or TypeScript with today, to be honest with you. And there's my big opinionated stance.
Yeah, but I mean, it would influence many, not all the decisions, but many of the stylistic decisions, I think. So I just wanted to put that caveat around it in case somebody was wondering.
Because I get asked a lot for the TypeScript version of the Angular 1 style guide, which I thought about making, but honestly, I think it's time to just put my efforts over to the Angular 2 guide instead. So, Joe, is there anything in particular you'd like to see in the Angular 2 style guide that we could talk about?
Well, I think we already talked about naming conventions, right?
Yeah, file names and symbols, pretty much the same structure as an Angular 1.
Right. So we've already got that part of it. What about things like pipes?
I don't smoke much, but so go ahead, Ward.
No, I was going to say, Joe, tell us what's on your mind, buddy. You brought that one up.
Well, I was just curious if there's already like recommendations for naming pipes, dealing with pipes, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you call them pipe.
Dealing with pipe.
Foo.pipe. I mean, that part we feel good about. The part that we're not so sure about is whether and how much how often you should write. Pipe. Exactly.
Yeah.
Should you smoke it or not? Now, frankly, if I were to look back at the equivalent in Angular 1, the filter, I was reluctant to write filters then either because of the performance implications, and I always felt that the logic that was in a filter, especially if it wasn't reused, belonged actually in the component itself.
So to me, there's two kinds of filters, Ward, and there's two kinds of pipes, right? There's filters that I used quite a bit, which were, in my way, formatters.
Right.
Yep.
Date filters, date pipes, currency filter pipes, whatever. Perfectly wonderful. But beyond that, honestly, I don't use filters or pipes for a lot of that kind of stuff. I felt like it was just too much performance hit, and I would just write my own custom logic.
I think that carries over to Angular 2, where it's actually very easy to write the equivalent of a filter, to write a pipe. I like to think of them as formatters. And I'm very wary of them. And Joe, gosh, nobody knows this better than you from the work you did on the pipe structure. How risky it gets when you start trying to use a pipe to manipulate large amounts of data.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the one pipe I'm leaving out of all this, too, is the async pipe, because I think that's a pipe that lends itself to a little bit more of discussion.
Right.
But
kind
custom pipes yeah, it really is. But I mean, as far as creating pipes go, I think they're easier in Angular 2 because there's actually, there's an interface you can follow, and it makes it easier to kind of know what you have to do and what you got to transform. But beyond naming convention at this point, I agree with Ward. I'm still hesitant on creating pipes unless I absolutely have no other way.
Yeah, I don't really this isn't necessarily supposed to be a discussion about pipes, but I've done a bunch of work with pipes. I've seen the problems with them. I wrote the documentation. I asked Ward if I could write the documentation because the existing documentation I didn't think was sufficient. And I still feel like the documentation that I've written is not sufficient because there's a lack of guidance about when and when not to use pipes and really informing people about them. So pipes are not my favorite feature, not because they're not a great feature, but because I think they can lead you down into a rabbit hole that you might find to be a lot more bear traps in. That's a really good analogy.
A rabbit hole with bear traps.
Rabbit hole
that have snakes that bite you with venom.
Yes.
Yeah. Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Why did it have to be snakes? Right. So pipes is formatters. Love it. Pipes is not formatters. I think you got to really know what you're doing before you start.
You got to beware.
Pipes says filters, not such a fan. Pipes says formats, yes.
Yeah. So, that being said, let's move on from pipes. What isn't in the style guide for Angular 2 right now that definitely will be in the style guide, but just hasn't had a chance to make it in there for one reason or another?
Well, first, if people want to check it out, if they go to the style guide in GitHub, they can check it out. And the one thing I've made a change on is I actually broke it up into 3 readmes. So it actually branches from Angular 1 to Angular 2. So you can check out what's going on in Angular 2. There are some things, I'll give you some what's in there and some what's not, and that will be there. Some of what's in there is I was able to copy over a lot of stuff from Angular 1, things like the rule of 1. That's in this guide, meaning you're going to have one component per file, one thing per file, and recommended to be less than 400 lines of code. And I say that because I have seen more code in the last 5 years that is like 5,000 lines of code in a file. And everybody gives me every reason in the world why that's justified, but I'm sorry. No.
Hey, Lukas is just getting started at 5,000 lines.
Well, I've only figured out what I'm doing after 5,000 lines. So I'm like, all right, now it's time to get out of business.
Now, but what you are saying, what I'm hearing is it's okay to have 5,000 lines so long as it's a single component.
There you go.
Well, all right, to keep with this topic, I think that one thing that Angular 2 is going to benefit from is there is no Angular 1 seed that exists for Angular 2. For those who were around 3 years ago when the Angular Seed project existed, it had a whole bunch of actually bad conventions in it.
Oh, Joe, don't worry. There isn't going to be one Angular 2 seed. There are going to be 10 of them.
At least.
Yeah.
At least.
They're already out there. And my only really strong recommendation is don't use any of them.
You know how many of the public yeoman generators or gulp generators or the slush generators I liked using in Angular 1? Close your eyes and what do you see?
Oh, man.
Nothing. They were all painful because, and there was nothing wrong with them in the sense of their opinionated versions of how to do something. But I just felt like people should have more choice.
Right. Well, I've been recently playing with, I guess you would call it a seed project. Auth0, I think, made it. It's Firebase and Angular 2. And oh my goodness, that thing is a bear. It is a big beast. Now, it's great that it's all set up and does what it needs to do. But it is a complex starting point, that's for sure. It's not really a seed. It's actually a working project. But it's the kind of thing you'd be like, oh, I want to do some Firebase with my Angular 2 project, and it's like the most common one you'd find if you started Googling around for that. And you might use that and say, all right, great, I'll just start here rather than figuring it all out for myself and start manipulating it. And oh my, it is quite a thing.
I think we're going to have a lot of that stuff come out. Like the CLI team, Command Line Interface team for Angular is trying to build something that's not only a generator, but it also does the build steps and the testing steps and the deployment steps and bundling, all that stuff. But it would be ideal, and I don't know where it's going to lead yet, but it would be ideal if the guide and the CLI kind of match up, which is one of the reasons I'm working with them to see where does this make sense.
I think John and I also, we have frequent conversations about our hope that there are ways to move in small steps and to not have to just push a button and get, this gigantic structure that you're wondering, what is all of this? So, there's a constant tension between the structure that we think you're going to need someday and what you need to get started. And there's a real temptation to create that one starter set that's got it all. That strikes us, I think, as a horrible trap.
I've heard a lot of negativity about your Quickstart, by the way, Ward, which you were the author of. In one sense, which may not shock you. So the Quickstart, the intention was to start you off small as possible, right? And people could build on it. Well, I've seen some negativity lately on it because people have tried to use that as the basis for large-scale apps, and they're like, it doesn't really work.
That's the tension that we talk about, is because you need something that doesn't overwhelm you, but you can't assume that that something that you learned on is going to carry you to a large application. So we need to be able to provide the kind of guidance that says, okay, now that you got there and you've exceeded the bounds of what that was intended for, how can you move stepwise to something that's more robust? But I see us doing that.
I don't get the complaint about Quickstart. I've used it recently. I mean, I'm actually looking at it right now. I'm not sure that I understand the nature of the complaint with Quickstart because I guess it's not a skeleton for an app with 35 features already in it, but if it was to be a skeleton for an app with 35 features, how would you have pre-named those features? In fact, even it is already a little bit more complex than you have to have, like the typings, for example. You don't have to have typings to start off with, so it's already starting you down some good roads. I guess is somewhat subjective, right?
The real key is, right, Joe, that when Ward and I kind of played it around, and this is something Ward and I probably spent way more hours on than anybody actually realizes. I'll bet you we spent 2 or 3 weeks battling around. How should it look? Yeah.
Absolutely, and that thing has been morphed so many times, and we're in constant tension with, do we add this one more thing because that could break the count? That could break people. And not in the sense that their code would break, but it wouldn't cease to be quick. It would cease to be transparent. Right. So it's a struggle. It's a real struggle.
Let me give you a concrete, tangible thing someone's complained about, and I see their point. I really do. I want to have, and I'm playing the role of the person here. It's one of the issues we hear a lot. I want to be able to not only put my Angular app in here, but I want to be able to have my Node server also in this folder structure.
Oh. Right.
And I don't like my source files to be in the root. I want them to be under a folder, maybe called source. So what they're simply asking for is instead of making app the folder you put everything in, you have like a source folder, which then has a client and a server folder. Mm-hmm. And then under the client folder, you've got an app folder, which is fine. And honestly, that's what I do in my production apps. But imagine the Quickstart now. You generate the Quickstart, you've got 3 levels of folders before you see, hello world.
And
there's two files in Quickstart that actually do anything in terms of what you can taste as a consumer of the app. And if it went, I can imagine a Quickstart that went source/client/app/ and now you got something, and people would look at me and say, "What the heck are you doing?"
Well,
especially since Angular 1 experience. Sorry, Joe. Angular 1 experience was, you open a file, you write a binding, put an ng app in there, and you're ready.
Right. You link to one CDN file, and there you go. You're up and running. Well, I think it's funny with the Quickstart that it has one subdirectory app that has 2 components. Well, the main TypeScript file and then a component as well in there, and which is crazy to put a subfolder just for 2 files, right?
Yes.
And from this standpoint, when you just look at it by itself, it's like, wow, you didn't even need that subfolder. You could have just put everything in the root.
Yes, and you know why that folder is actually there? Because Ward and I went through this part. We were trying to get rid of it, but to get rid of it, we had to make special arrangements with the System.js loading.
System.js doesn't like to load out of the root, does it?
Yeah, we got it to work, but it made System.js configuration really ugly, and we're like, you know what? I think people will be okay with the folder.
There's 2 ways to handle that, right? You can either just give it the exact extension in the System.js load, or you can do it in config, apparently.
Yeah, or you could just avoid the extensions and just do them all in the import statements too. And
but the more you do that, you pay an awful price right away everywhere else. It seemed the cheapest price when we looked at all the variations. Like, if I just paste this thing in and can start writing, how soon will I have to go back and touch that again? And this was the way to say, do it once, and then you're going to be able to spend many days before you have to go back and look at that again.
Well, personally,
the reality is you're going to have a folder, right? You're going to have a folder eventually anyway.
Yeah, personally, I agree with that. You're going to have some subfolder. But the idea of, hey, I got to put my notes over here. Well, how does that help somebody who's using Java or .NET on their back end? Right, it doesn't.
Yeah. No, right.
You don't have the same concerns. So you're catering to a subgroup of people.
You know what else I hated in there, but I couldn't figure out what to do, is you look at that index.html, and there's a gazillion libraries at the top. And the first 3 of them are just to deal with IE. Now, I didn't have those there in the beginning, but then people would say it doesn't work. And you say, what doesn't work? The Quickstart doesn't work.
Angular sucks. I'm going to React because you suck. That's
you mean it doesn't work in IE, or it doesn't work in Safari? Oh, and so I just didn't want those calls anymore. So I throw those things in the top.
Yeah.
This is the life of somebody trying to come up with something that is small enough to get you going, but
and
rich
none of
enough.
These are Angular concerns, right? These are all not Angular concerns at all.
So outside of, to not be too nitpicky here, why do you have your scripts in your head instead of at the end of your body?
Because I heard...
That sounds funny, sorry.
That's a question that I have tripped over. And what I learned he's one of the authorities on browser performance, is that thing about moving them at the bottom. Mm-hmm. There are 2 things about that. One, browsers are smarter than when that advice first came out, and so they do the right thing, so actually having them ahead doesn't hurt. The second thing to observe is that nothing happens Angular-wise until you get through those scripts anyway, so moving to the body doesn't leave you... it doesn't make the page start any sooner. It just ends, it's, so go ahead. Move them, see if it makes any difference. It won't.
And since we're using a system loader, it's not like people are sticking in more scripts and are going to start filling up the head with slow loading scripts, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. As a matter of fact, the way we do it with the system loader, basically, again, for development, is you load one file. Then it's, you pay to play. Things load as you hit them.
And for those who may not know this, if the system.import statement, which is in the head, it's an asynchronous statement, so it actually doesn't start loading the file until the document's been completely rendered and loaded.
Yeah,
Sorry, John, I wanted to say one more thing. The other part of the point of the Quickstart is that it's there to help you start learning Angular 2. And there have been people who wanted to put performance improvements in, and it's like, wait a minute. You're so far away from figuring out how to package this thing up and minify it and optimize it and stuff like that. That's not what this is about. This is about getting you going. And it's a very different ambition than to come up with the optimal downstream solution for production conditions that I can't anticipate anyway.
So we want to circle this back around to the style guide by talking about that, and that is that this is difficult when trying to teach people things and give them advice because there are varying levels of where people are at and what their needs are, right? And if you consider people in one category, you can potentially ignore people in another. So people who are just learning, well, you give them some advice that's simple and easy to learn, but later on, if they keep going down the same road, they might have some performance problems. If you give them more complex advice up front, maybe they would be following a better performance pattern, but yet have a more difficult time up front. And that can happen, the same idea with the style guide, right? If you consider how you write the style guide, you've got to try to solve problems for the largest set of people, right?
You do, and you want to, at least I want to, when I'm defining this stuff, and I think when Ward was doing the Quickstart, the idea is you want to help people put them on a path that's easy to learn and won't leave them in a place where they're going to run into a brick wall later. So, for example, I'm teaching my daughter to drive right now, and it's a fun experience, but I don't want to overwhelm her with every rule of the road when I'm driving. So, for example, we were learning how to take left turns the other day on a 3-lane road. And she's asking me all these questions, and, there's all these different rules about when you take left-hand turns, what you do, and she's referring to the book. I said, look, do you see the white lines on the road, the white dashes around the turn? She goes, yep. I go, just stay inside those. Just simple rules in the beginning. And what that does, it puts them on a path to see where they're going. And the other rule she picked up her own is, I'll just follow the car in front of me. Hey, that works too, right? Now, those aren't the rules of how you drive. There's no, law that says just follow the car in front of you. But learn when you're starting to get started with these things in Angular or driving a car that it's easier to learn simple rules first that won't later on drive you into a lake or, or off a cliff somewhere. So in Angular, for example, in the Quickstart, a lot of these things and a lot of the style guide stuff is to say, hey, let's put you on a path where you can be successful in small chunks. And then when you want to grow and it's time to grow, there'll be no refactoring that's rewrite your app. But it'll be, okay, now I want another folder. Or now I feel like I need a service and a component. Or now I need to do this and split these out. It's always, let's just break things up more, as opposed to, now I got to delete all this other stuff and start over. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I wanted to mention in Angular 2 some of the things that we didn't discuss that are not yet in the guide, which people are clamoring over. And one of those is, what is the folder structure, and how do you define what's in an Angular 2 app? And I know there's a lot of opinions on this, and there's no clearly defined, great way yet. I have something in my head of what I think is probably going to be the way we end up running with, based on a lot of feedback we've gathered. But I've seen many, many seed projects already, and Ward alluded to this, where people are defining these folder structures for Angular 2 apps, which I think it's hard to define what it's going to look like at this point, because people are trying to take into consideration things like lazy loading. How's that going to work with modules and routes? How do you define features that could be promoted to an NPM repository or NPM package later? Where do you put shared libraries? Do you do by feature still, or do you do by feature and then by type? So there's all these questions that kind of have to come out. And overall, I think the structures are going to look very similar to what's in Angular 1. But I think we're going to have to take into consideration some new things because technology has evolved, and now things like lazy loading, we can actually make some different changes that will improve it. But that's not there right now.
I know we're sounding very diffuse, and the fact is that there are certain emerging patterns that are Angular 2-ish, and we have to pull them together, but it's still, what you're hearing is some hesitancy to codify them just yet. I'll give you another example. I have a feeling about how to organize to use the router, how to organize your code to use the router, but I don't want to mandate it yet until I've seen enough examples that prove it out, right? So there are some emerging patterns there that I think are going to turn into recommendations, but let's not jump the gun.
Well, let me give you some tangible things that are there. So here's one in the Angular 2 style guide, and I put the link in the notes, where it says defer logic to services. Might sound familiar from Angular 1. That still stays the same in Angular 2. We still want to take our logic out of our components and move them to services for sharing purposes and to keep those components slim and trim. Another one might be, hey, look, services are singletons. So keep this in mind when you're building things. However, you can also provide services. You can use the injector, which is hierarchical in Angular 2, to define services at multiple levels and have multiple instances if you want to. And I define some ways on how you can do that in the guide. But then we've got some things that are more stylistic, like, how do you define your public and private properties? How do you sequence them? So all that stuff's there as well.
When should you use decorators? When should you use the metadata arrays that are inside the add component decorator? We have very specific recommendations along those lines, too.
And one of my favorites, which I haven't written yet, but I'd love to put in here, is the concept of a barrel. I really like this. It didn't exist with the Angular 1 stuff, but it becomes really important in Angular 2. What a barrel is let me describe the problem. So we have, let's say, a folder called shared stuff. Inside of there, I've got 5 pipes because Joe likes pipes. There's 5 pipe files. And then we've got components, and we've got some services, and we've got some directives. We got a whole bunch of things. They're all in this folder, and they might even be in nested folders under this shared folder. Okay, so let's say I'm building a component in another folder called, customers component. And the customers component needs to use 7 of those shared things. So now I've got to write 7 different import statements because all 7 of the things might be in different files. So at the top of my customers component, I got 7 lines of code that's kind of yucky. That's a technical term for garbage. So we say import such and such from this shared folder, import such and such from that shared folder. And instantly your component looks really verbose and hard to read. So one of the ideas there is a barrel. Wouldn't it be great if we could just have one import statement at the top of that customer component that says, import these things from this shared folder? Well, we can do that by creating a barrel inside of the shared folder, and the barrel essentially is a file that does 2 things. It imports everything under the shared folder, and then it exports those immediately. So therefore, we have one point in the shared folder that says, go find everything under this directory structure, and then re-export it. And that way, our import statement stays really, really tight inside of all the places that we import shared stuff. And this is something that Angular 2 uses, so that's why we can say things like import component from Angular 2/core, because they use barrels inside of Angular 2 to make it easier for us to not have to remember where is everything located. Did that make sense, or did I totally muff that?
Sounds good to me.
I mean, do you guys notice, a lot of times you're writing demos, you end up with a component, and you've got 20 lines of imports at the top of the page, and it's like, what happened here? Yeah. So the barrel's solution to that, because I got tired of showing demos in front of people and their jaws hitting the floor. Angular 2 looks hard simply because they see all the import statements. So that was a way to help solve that.
All right, well, I think that we're reaching the end of the time for the episode anyway. This was actually a really awesome episode. Love episodes like this, and very interesting for the near future as we see the style guide get fleshed out. So we've got links in the show notes to the style guide. I think it's also very easy to find it if you just Google Angular style guide, because it gets to the one repo that links to both style guides. Angular 2 style guide is in a pretty short form right now, of course, right?
Yep, there are only about 20 rules in it right now, or 20 guidelines in it.
Right. So a great place to check out for more reading. Let's move on to the pick, shall we?
Whenever I have a new idea for an app, one of the first things I do is go find a domain name for it. The company I use, and have used for years, is Hover.com. Hover.com has a clean and easy-to-use interface. They don't try to upsell me on a bunch of services I don't want or need, and they provide free whois masking for the domains I register. So if I register a domain that's not directly tied to devchat.tv, people don't need to know that I'm the one that owns it. They also offer domains with all kinds of top-level domains like .codes and .computer, and others like .coffee and .pizza. So when you have your next idea strike, go to hover.com/adventures to get it. Once again, that's hover.com/adventures.
Ward, do you want to go first?
I'm picking the Warriors. Like you've got the Star Wars to follow. I am watching Warriors basketball, and I'm loving it. Of course, I'm from here. So, if you're not writing in Angular 2, then you should be watching the Warriors.
The Star Warriors
Beg your pardon?
Star Wars. Nice, Lucas. Nice. Hey, Ward, what do you call a Warriors fan 2 years ago? A Lakers fan.
Oh. Yeah, no, I'm a bandwagon guy. You know, as soon as they suck again, I'm going to stop watching.
I'm out. They are playing the Jazz tonight.
They are.
Yep.
And you know what? They got on a plane at 2 a.m. in the morning last night after playing a hard game, and they have to play again tonight. It's not fair, but they're still going to win.
Life's rough. Life's rough for those guys. I feel bad for them.
I do.
Yep. Crying in my beer over it. My root beer, of course. I don't drink beer. All right, Lucas, how about you?
So my pick this week is the NPR Tiny Desk concerts, which you can find on YouTube. And it's just basically they have people come in and do concerts at the desk of the NPR offices. There's just a ton of really great acts. I've kind of discovered a lot of really neat artists that I didn't know about. And then my sub pick is there's a band called Snarky Puppies, which also did like this NPR concert, and I had forgotten about them. But Matthias Wolowski, who is one of the co-founders of Auth0, his brother Marcello is a percussionist for Snarky Puppy, and it's kind of this jazz fusion band that's just super awesome. And so my picks this week are the NPR Tiny Desk concerts and Snarky Puppy. Super awesome music.
Awesome. John, how about you?
I've got a couple here. One is I'm really excited to pass along the news that hopefully most of you heard by now. Microsoft is adding the Linux command line to Windows 10. So we're actually going to have full bash, not Cygwin, but real bash running on Windows. So some of us, I know, Joe, you're a Windows guy, right?
Yep. Well,
so this would be pretty cool.
No. I'm a Windows and Mac guy. I'm half and half.
Yeah, and I'm mostly Mac,
Windows.
but
the right half of me is Mac.
Well, you know, the reason it's exciting to me is most of my developers at work actually use Windows, so this will make their lives a little bit easier, so they don't have to convert over. But
I am a Bash shell guy, though. On Windows, I only use a Bash shell, which when I record Pluralsight courses, I'm sure confuses a lot of Windows developers.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty exciting to see where this leads, and to even think how monumental this is. I mean, me being a guy, I used to work at Microsoft 5 years ago. And back then, to think that they would do this, I mean, you would like be walked out of the building. So it's pretty monumental to see this change. The second pick I have something called RAML.org. It's a RESTful API modeling language, and they picked themselves as an easy way to design APIs. It is YAML, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it's a great way to think of it like Swagger for APIs. Instead of documenting so much, you can actually design the APIs using a YAML structure, and then it'll kind of generate some of this stuff out for you. So it's kind of neat. It's something I've been playing around with, and it's a nice little tool. Oh, and by the way, I'm picking Star Wars.
Oh. Brutal.
Good job. All right, is that it, John?
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks for being so respectful.
No problem, Joe.
All right. Well, I also want to pick Star Wars since I just saw it for the 6th time.
You guys.
But instead of picking actually anything, there's one pick that I want to make, and that is I want to pick listening. So there's been a ton of stuff I've been reading about on the internet, some controversies in the tech world, other things, and the politics that are going on. The one thing that I keep running into over and over again is a whole bunch of people shouting at everybody else, wanting them to listen to their opinion, and being completely unwilling to listen and be respectful to other people's opinions. And there was a tweet that, John, you sent out a while ago related to this. And it's actually been sort of not just on my mind, but actually like a bother to me recently, like how incapable people can be of saying, I disagree, but I'm willing to at least listen and hear your side of the story, and in the end, make the assumption that you don't choose your opinion based on the fact that you're a horrible person, but instead that it makes sense to you.
You mean like how we talked about the style guide and how you disagreed earlier?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly like that. Exactly.
I mean, it's the way you should take it, right? I mean, there's no offense on either side. You just state your points, and why can't all developers have conversations like that, Joe, huh?
Yeah. So there's been definitely some just interesting stuff and people getting really upset at other people for the decisions that they've made that, and just an inability in people being completely incapable of just being able to sit and say, all right, tell me what you think. And in the end, I'm still going to do what I was going to do, but at least now I understand what you're saying and why you're saying it, what your opinion is, and what your position is. And I think that the world needs a lot more of that and gets very little. And I see it all the time on the internet. In fact, it comes from the people who are telling other people that they are not listening. It's amazing how little people listen to each other. So, and I'm probably no better at it than anybody else, but I certainly see it a lot.
We all do it, man. We all do it, and I think it's important to remember sometimes, how would you feel if you were on the receiving end of what you're about to say?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. The ability to say, I disagree, but I will listen to what you have to say. You listen to me. We'll understand each other, whether we agree or not. Because people are you're never going to get everybody to agree, but at least they can sit and listen and understand and be respectful. And we need a lot more of that in our world. So that's my pick.
I said, well said, Joe. I appreciate that.
Kind of a rambling statement, but there's my pick. So, all right, that's it for our episode. Thanks, guys, for an engaging and fascinating conversation. And thanks for all of our listeners. We'll be back again next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.